Hello everyone, today we read and comment the 10th chapter of the 4th book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege, the title being Effects of Victory, Continuation. The text follows. According to the point from which our view is taken, we may feel as much astonished at the extraordinary result of some great battles as at the want of results in others. We shall dwell for a moment on the nature of the effect of a great victory. Three things may easily be distinguished here: the effect upon the instrument itself, that is, upon the generals and their armies, the effect upon the states interested in the war, and the particular result of these effects as manifested in the subsequent course of the campaign. If we only think of the trifling difference which there usually is between victor and vanquished in killed, wounded, prisoners, and artillery lost on the field of battle itself, the consequences which are developed out of this insignificant point seem often quite incomprehensible, and yet usually everything only happens quite naturally. We have already said in the 7th chapter that the magnitude of a victory increases not merely in the same measure as the vanquished forces increase in number, but in a higher ratio. The moral effects resulting from the issue of a great battle are greater on the side of the conquered than on that of the conqueror. They lead to greater losses in physical force, which then in turn react on the moral element, and so they go on mutually supporting and intensifying each other. On this moral effect we must therefore lay special weight. It takes an opposite direction on the one side from that on the other. As it undermines the energies of the conquered, so it elevates the powers and energy of the conqueror, but its chief effect is upon the vanquished, because here it is the direct cause of fresh losses, and besides it is homogeneous in nature, with danger, with the fatigues, the hardships, and generally with all those embarrassing circumstances by which war is surrounded, and therefore enters into league with them, and increases by their help, whilst with the conqueror all these things are like weights which give a higher swing to his courage. It is therefore found that the vanquished sinks much further below the original line of equilibrium than the conqueror raises himself above it. On this account, if we speak of the effects of victory, we allude more particularly to those which manifest themselves in the army. In this effect is more powerful in an important combat than in a smaller. If this effect is more powerful in an important combat than in a smaller one, so again it is much more powerful in a great battle than in a minor one. The great battle takes place for the sake of itself, for the sake of the victory which it is to give, and which is sought for with the utmost effort. Here on this spot, in this very hour, to conquer the enemy is the purpose in which the plan of the war with all its threads converges, in which all distant hopes, all dim glimmerings of the future meet. Fate steps in before us to give an answer to the bold question. This is the state of mental tension not only of the commander, but of his whole army down to the lowest wagon driver, no doubt in decreasing strength, but also in decreasing importance. According to the nature of the thing, a great battle has never at any time been an unprepared, unexpected, blind routine service, but a grand act which partly of itself, and partly from the aim of the commander, stands out from amongst the mass of ordinary efforts sufficiently to raise the tension of all minds to a higher degree. But the higher this tension with respect to the issue, the more powerful must be the effect of that issue. Again, the moral effect of victory in our battles is greater than it was in the earlier ones of modern military history. If the former are, as we have depicted them, a real struggle of forces to the utmost, then the sum total of all these forces, of the physical as well as the moral, must decide more than certain special dispositions of mere chance. A single fault committed may be repaired next time. From good fortune and chance we can hope for more favor on another occasion, but the sum total of moral and physical powers cannot be so quickly altered, and therefore what the award of a victory has decided appears of much greater importance for all futurity. Very probably, of all concerned in battles, whether in or out of the army, very few have given a thought to this difference, but the course of the battle itself impresses on the minds of all present in it such a conviction, and the relation of this course in public documents, however much it may be colored by twisting particular circumstances, shows also more or less to the world at large that the causes were more of a general than a particular nature. He who has not been present at the loss of a great battle will have difficulty in forming for himself a living or quite true idea of it, and the abstract notions of this or that small untoward affair will never come up to the perfect conception of a lost battle. Let us drop a moment at the picture. The first thing which overpowers the imagination, and we may indeed say also the understanding, is the diminution of the masses. Then the loss of ground, which takes place always more or less, and therefore on the side of the assailant also if he is not fortunate. Then the rupture of the original formation, the jumbling together of troops, the risks of retreat, which with few exceptions may always be seen sometimes in a less, sometimes in a greater degree. Next, the retreat, the most part of which commences at night, or at least goes on throughout the night. On this first march we must at once leave behind a number of men completely worn out and scattered about, often just the bravest, who have been foremost in the fight, who held out the longest. The feeling of being conquered, which only seized the superior officers on the battlefield, now spreads through all ranks, even down to the common soldiers, aggravated by the horrible idea of being obliged to leave in the enemy's hands so many brave comrades who but a moment since were of such value to us in the battle, and aggravated by a rising distrust of the chief, to whom more or less every subordinate attributes as a fault the fruitless efforts he has made. And this feeling of being conquered is no ideal picture over which one might become master. It is an evident truth that the enemy is superior to us, a truth of which the causes may have been so latent before that they were not to be discovered, but which, in the issue comes out clear and palpable, on which was also perhaps before suspected, but which in the want of any certainty we had to oppose by the hope of chance, reliance on good fortune, providence, or a bold attitude. Now all this has proved insufficient, and the bitter truth meets us harsh and imperious. All these feelings are widely different from a panic, which in any army fortified by military virtue never, and in any other only exceptionally, follows the loss of a battle. They must arise even in the best armies, and although long habituation to war and victory, together with great confidence in a commander, may modify them a little here and there, they are never entirely wanting in the first moment. They are not the pure consequences of lost trophies. These are usually lost at a later period, and the loss of them does not become generally known so quickly. They will therefore not fail to appear even when the scale turns in the slowest and most gradual manner, and they constitute that effect of a victory upon which we can always count in every case. We have already said that the number of trophies intensifies this effect. It is evident that an army in this condition, looked at as an instrument, is weakened. How can we expect then that when reduced to such a degree that, as we said before, it finds new enemies in all the ordinary difficulties of making war, it will be able to recover by fresh efforts what has been lost? Before the battle there was a real or assumed equilibrium between the two sides. This is lost, and therefore some external assistance is requisite to restore it. Every new effort without such external support can only lead to fresh losses. Thus, therefore, the most moderate victory of the chief army must tend to a constant sinking of the scale of the opponent's side, until new external circumstances bring about a change. If these are not near, if the conqueror is an eager opponent who, thirsting for glory, pursues great aims, then a first-rate commander and in the beaten army a true military spirit, hardened by many campaigns, are required, in order to stop the swollen stream of prosperity from bursting all bounds, and to moderate its course by a small but reiterated act of resistance, until the force of victory has spent itself at the goal of its career. And now as to the effect of defeat beyond the army upon the nation and government. It is the sudden collapse of the hopes stretched to the utmost, the downfall of all self-reliance. In place of these extinct forces, fear, with its destructive properties of expansion, rushes into the vacuum left and completes the prostration. It is a real shock upon the nerves, which one of the two athletes receives from the electric spark of victory, and that effect, however different in its degrees, is never completely wanting. Instead of every one hastening with a spirit of determination to aid in repairing the disaster, every one fears that his efforts will only be in vain and stops hesitating with himself when he should rush forward. Or in despondency he lets his arm drop, leaving everything to fate. The consequence which this effect of victory brings forth in the course of war itself depend in part on the character and talent of the victorious general, but more on the circumstances from which the victory proceeds and to which it leads. Without boldness and an enterprising spirit on the part of the leader, the most brilliant victory will lead to no great success, and its force exhausts itself all the sooner on circumstances if these offer a strong and stubborn opposition to it. How very differently from Daun Frederick the Great would have used the victory at Kolin. In what different consequences France, in place of Russia, might have given a battle of Leuthen. The conditions which allow us to expect great results from a great victory we shall learn when we have come to the subjects with which they are connected. Then it will be possible to explain the disproportion which appears at first sight between the magnitude of a victory and its results, and which is only too readily attributed to a want of energy on the part of the conqueror. Here, where we have to do with the great battle in itself, we shall merely say that the effects now depicted never fail to attend a victory, that they mount up with the intensive strength of the victory, mount up the more the whole strength of the army has been concentrated in it, the more the whole military power of the nation is contained in that army, and the state in that military power. But then the question may be asked, can theory accept this effect of victory as absolutely necessary? Must it not rather endeavor to find out counteracting means capable of neutralizing these effects? It seems quite natural to answer this question in the affirmative, but heaven defend us from taking that wrong course of most theories, out of which is begotten a mutually devouring pro et contra. Certainly that effect is perfectly necessary, for it has its foundation in the nature of things, and it exists even if we find means to struggle against it, just as the notion of a cannonball the motion of a cannonball is always in the direction of the terrestrial, though when fired from east to west, part of the general velocity is destroyed by this opposed motion. All war supposes human weakness, and against that is directed. Therefore, if hereafter in another place we examine what is to be done after the loss of a great battle, if we bring under review the resources which still remain, even in the most desperate cases, if we should express a belief in the possibility of retrieving all, even in such a case, it must not be supposed we mean thereby that the effects of such a defeat can by degrees be completely wiped out, for the forces and means used to repair the disaster might have been applied to the realization of some positive object, and this applies both to the moral and physical forces. Another question is whether through the loss of a great battle forces are not perhaps roused into existence which otherwise would never have come to life. This case is certainly conceivable, and it is what has actually occurred with many nations, but to produce this intensified reaction is beyond the province of military art, which can only take account of it where it might be assumed as a possibility. If there are cases in which the fruits of a victory appear rather of a destructive nature in consequence of the reaction of the forces which it had the effect of rousing into activity, cases which certainly are very exceptional, then it must be the more surely be granted that there is a difference in the effects which one and the same victory may produce according to the character of the people or state which has been conquered. So, beautiful chapter in which von Clausewitz describes more thoroughly the effects of victory, taking us fundamentally throughout the properly the defeated side, right, and conversely realizing what this is, because the defeated is the one that fundamentally on which the effects of victory the greatest effect of victory, in the devastating nature of what the violence, the destruction of battle it's been, and all its moral consequences are to be felt. This is a concept of dramatic importance because not only it teaches us something that is rarely done, if anything, for sympathy, for instance, that is, not to think of the defeated sign, right, as one that objectively, we often think as if, that it was deterministically decided, right, and therefore someone had to lose, right, and war is, as we've seen here, in the domain of fate or chance, right, it was one of the elements of the Clausewitzian Trinity. It's properly not to be forced, right? And if one especially goes to fight out there, and especially in the here, Clausewitz is talking about chiefly the great battle, right? That is fought for the sake of itself, so that it has it's as close as possible to the objective of destroying the enemy, right? By definition, right, destroying its armed forces, bringing the war to an end, ideally, right? And we have explained here what is that Von Clausewitz really means by talking about great battle, right? And it's approximate idea of what the tension towards absolute war should be about, right? And indeed, as far as humans, in terms of our human metric perception of certain things is concerned, the greatest battles, could think not just of more contemporary times, even of the ancient warfare, that are less devastating compared to today, that are still something utterly devastating, right? In a way that all the moral effects of victory are felt in tearing yourself apart. Right. Sometimes at the point you wish you had not even, come out of there alive. Secondly, von Clausewitz also looks at how the moral effects of victory impact properly the other two elements of the Clausewitzian Trinity, aside from the military and its kind of nature of its gambling nature, if you want, as he puts that. That is, politics and society, right? How properly the governments, the countries react to this, and why there is this such apparent contradiction of the imbalance between what the strictly military effects are of a victory. That, for example, as Clausewitz starts by now, says, there may not be dramatic differences on the field, but this will have enormous consequences on a strategical level in a very different way, in a very asymmetric sense, and they eventually rooting properly in the same motivation of that state to fight, because of course the military doesn't exist as such. It's just a part of that politics and that society in practice. So this is extremely important to stress. So, okay, the effects of victory, continuation. Von Clausewitz writes, according to the point from which our view is taken, we may feel as much astonished at the extraordinary results of some great battles as at the want of results in others. We shall dwell for a moment on the nature of the effect of a great victory. Right? So he says, it happens objectively that great battles have also smaller battles for that matter, but they can have devastatingly different outcomes from a broader point of view, strategical and political, at the end of the day, that seem to be disconnected sometimes by what objectively is being gathered, what is being collected on the field of battle proper. Clausewitz says three things may easily be distinguished here: the effect upon the instrument in itself, that is, in fact, upon the generals and their armies, right? So from a strictly military point of view, to the army. The effect upon the states interested in the war. So the committants, if we could use this term. And the particular result of these effects as manifested. It's more than the committants, though, by the way. That's why this is, in fact, an expression von Clausewitz does not use proper, because it's more than that. It's as if you had, lost a hand in the process, right? And you were as a general or as a government or a country after defeat, right? Or even more than that. And the particular results of these effects as manifested in the subsequent course of the campaign. Alright, so from a strategical point of view. Then he writes, if we only think of the trifling difference which there usually is between victor and vanquished in killed, wounded, prisoners, and artillery lost in the field of battle itself, the consequences which are developed out of this insignificant point seem often quite incomprehensible, and yet usually everything only happens quite naturally. Right? That is, we shouldn't be tricked by appearance, and this appearance is, as von Clausewitz says here, that if you really look at how war is fought, like it doesn't seem a big deal maybe that in a single battle, like I don't know, there are 2,000 dead from one side and 3,000 from one other, and say that the latter has lost, and this produces an enormous consequence that you wouldn't, it's just 1,000 dead of difference, right? Maybe the guy lost even more troops during the entire campaign. What's the deal? This is what we're going to explain in the chapter. So von Clausewitz goes on, says, we have already said in the 7th chapter that the magnitude of a victory increases not merely in the same measure as the vanquished forces increase in number, but in a higher ratio. Remember that, there is naturally, even to always to bear in mind, since the beginning of Vom Kriege, the difference, the sum of moral and physical forces, right? So you could say, okay, you have lost all these troops, but it's mostly the moral side of the story, where that is impacted by the outcome of a battle. That's the one that gets puzzled and tired and exhausted and at the loss of the battle, and produces therefore in terms of properly of the defeat proper. This is already partly a way to dialectically answer the question, is of course that to put it simply, what you lose on the field in terms of dead, prisoners, artillery, because it's talking about, is material, right? But the moral force lost there is enormous. Can be enormous. At least there is this great, this connection between the overlapping of the moral and physical forces. The moral ones are way larger, way easier to especially after a defeat, to flare, like in this negative sense. And also there are the ones that before, of course, the outcome of the battle are the more swinging in many ways, and the ones in which you should be playing the most in this sense, right? It's not about which rifle or cannon you have. It's all about who's the person who's using it. And no, not just in technical ability. Literally, what are the motivations that the person is brought there? That this is one of the aspects for which I always also often say that technology in practice has virtually no importance, right? First of all, if you don't use it without a doctrine, it has literally zero importance, because you may have the greatest technology ever, not finding a field of application, not knowing how to use it. It's completely useless. Could be actually even more costly, right? In terms of cost-effects ratio, could be even unfavorable. But more in special, you can have all the technology you fight. If you don't have the will to fight, there is nothing there that technology can do for you, or at least there is something at that point it can do. But at the same time, it's not the point of how properly wars are fought, right? Because there is a reason there. It's not a chess game, right? You just do it for refreshment. So in fact, von Clausewitz says the moral effects resulting from the issue of a great battle are greater on the side of the conquered than on that of the conqueror, right? Daily, but this is also important because of course who wins is elated by obviously is morally benefiting from it, but there is no comparison at that point between the happiness of a winner and the despair of a defeated. The latter's moral difference is way greater, right? It's not always like this, right? It's not always in the sense that tendentially it is always like this, In single circumstances, can be the other way around, but in here we also have to understand what's the right, that we are abandoning tactics to enter into strategy, to enter into politics. So a lot of things there, a lot of forces can be re-injected in a way, but as far as the absolute loss is concerned there, there are certain things that cannot be properly recovered from this, and this is what, for the sake of battle, that here we are concerned. For Clausewitz says, in fact, that they lead the moral effects, where he's talking about, to greater losses in physical force, which then in turn react on the moral element, and so they go on mutually supporting and intensifying each other. On this moral effect, we must so you understand the point. They get obviously always compenetrated. There is never a detachment, right, between the moral and the physical reality, but the moral one is more important. On this moral effect we must therefore lay special weight. It takes an opposite direction on the one side from that on the other. As it undermines the energies of the conquered, so it elevates the powers and energy of the conqueror, right? There's a reciprocity, of course, in this as well, in relative terms, right? But its chief effect is upon the vanquished. Here's the absolute one instead, because here it is the direct cause of fresh losses, and besides, it is homogeneous in nature with danger, with the fatigues, the hardships, and generally with all those embarrassing circumstances by which war is surrounded. Therefore, enters into league with them and increases by their help. Whilst with the conqueror, all these things are like weights which give a higher swing to his courage. Right. This is extremely important because von Clausewitz here observes how properly the moral forces of the vanquished and the vanquisher react to what is the realm of war, as von Clausewitz himself has often defined: danger, fatigues, hardships, in to very different ways, in opposite ways. Like for the defeated, actually, what the defeat means is that these fatigues, hardships, and this danger, especially in these embarrassing circumstances, are increased because the defeat is immediately translated into them. Right? It's not that they are detached; that there is an enormous risk after that increases. For the conqueror, it's instead all these hardships are matter of pride. That is to say, look at what we have done and how we have made it. We have earned that. Right? There is this sense of rightfulness, of justification. Maybe Clausewitz doesn't intend this because not from this strictly moral sense that he talks about, of course, the moral one, as you understand, but it's important to stress they have this opposite effect. Von Clausewitz says, it is therefore found that the vanquished sinks much further below the original line of equilibrium than the conqueror raises himself above it. Right? The vanquisher raises himself after victory. Yea, for the vanquished, it's like, oh, we lost. It's pure devastation. So, on this account, Clausewitz writes, if we speak of the effects of victory, we allude more particularly to those which manifest themselves in the army. If this effect is more powerful in an important combat than in a smaller one, so again it is much more powerful in a great battle than in a minor one. And we also have observed this in the previous chapters, in which von Clausewitz has showed why it's the case that, of course, the greater the battle is, and we could say the greater, as we'll see also better later on, the moral and physical forces committed are in it, the greater the devastation will be, right? Especially from the side that has put more to that. Whereas in smaller fights, smaller combats, it may as well be that, after all, in proportion proper, the outcome brings to a minor discouragement. For example, in case of defeat, also generally the outcome is felt to be much more randomly, to have much more randomly occurred, right? In smaller engagements, even dramatically hopeless odds can be more easily reversed than in a great battle where the hard core of the forces employed in the war is is fighting, so that it's you can't avoid that, right? You can't pretend as if that battle was just like a minor one in proportion. It's in terms of moral outcome, especially, it's way more important, and its consequences may be even decisive for the course of the war. In fact, von Clausewitz writes, the great battles take place for the sake of itself, as we were saying before, for the sake of the victory which it is to give, and which is sought for with the utmost effort. Here on this spot, in this very hour, to conquer the enemy is the purpose in which the plan of the war, with all its threads, converges, in which all distant hopes, all dim glimmerings of the future meet. Fate steps in before us to give an answer to the bold question. This is the state of mental tension not only of the commander, but of his whole army, down to the lowest wagon driver, no doubt, in decreasing strength, but also in decreasing importance, right? It's particularly important to stress also, obviously, the fact that leadership has, as always, an enormous burden that the lower troops cannot properly understand. Even if they get killed, even if they suffer the worst of the physical point of view, the unspeakable, yet the moral burden there of the command is overwhelming, right? There is no comparison. And also, let's not digress in the usual things of prejudices about World War I, but you know what I'm talking about if you follow the channel. Here, von Clausewitz stresses also the idea of what the Great Battle is basically about, as we were saying at the beginning, and so it reinforces the reason why the moral consequences of a great battle are in proportion way more important than the one of a small skirmish, right? In proportion proper, right? Because it's there is no, if you let's say narrow the scale, the battle would have more. The greater battle at that point wouldn't be so great. So you narrow the scale, but in proportion, if you make the measure, you could measure in absolute terms, it's way more devastating. So von Clausewitz says, according to the nature of the thing, a great battle has never at any time been an unprepared, unexpected, blind routine service, but a grand act, which partly of itself and partly from the aim of the commander stands out from amongst the mass of ordinary force, sufficiently to raise the tension of all minds to a higher degree. But the higher this tension with respect to the issue, the more powerful must be the effect of that issue. Right? This explains it beautifully. Right? Of course, we could say many things about this paragraph. The most important thing here is also an advice from a strictly military historical point of view. Never think that great engagements throughout all the history of mankind are something fortuitous, that are something, that, was not thought of thoroughly, that there is no logic in military decisions, that you could have done better, right? Because, you can study the thing after, many centuries and, you presume you can, no. Right? All great battles have a logic that is invariably and evidently pretty sound, right? There can be mistakes, there can be lots of problems in many ways, but the logic of the battle in itself, I mean, the reason for which you should come to that point is actually it's actually in war, in relative terms, the strongest, the more logical, rational consequence of war in the first place, right? And as a consequence, that's why it's the higher tension it presents and the greater moral effect it achieves in its result. And von Clausewitz writes, again, the moral effect of victory in our battles, so he's talking about his own times, is greater than it was in the earlier ones of modern military history. In the former, as we have depicted them, a real struggle of forces to the utmost, then the sum of total of all these forces, of the physical as well as the moral, must decide more than certain special dispositions of mere chance. So to make it brutal, von Clausewitz is talking about Napoleonic warfare, where battles were something gigantic that in military history had never been seen before by sheer amount of numbers, coordination. So this brought the battle much closer to a strategical reality where it's more like a matter of attrition than, let's say, a specific movement maneuver on the field that saves the thing. Whereas ancient warfare, medieval warfare, also partly, essentially, early modern warfare, were about, what like a single line behaves like, or where there is attack from the flank, right? So something, if you want more, can say more accidental, because even in there was a pretty strong iron logic, but something that here now it's been amplified because of course the battle has become greater, right? Here we're not talking about the great battle in terms of in relative terms to the times, right? We could do it if you're talking about the strategic context and so on, but in absolute terms it's pretty obvious, right? More forces involved, greater power, generally speaking, the same same military means, etc. But this is important, really, also to understand where we stand compared to the times that von Clausewitz is talking about, and never fall into the mistake that von Clausewitz is talking now exclusively about Napoleonic warfare. He's obviously talking about the entire warfare in not in past history, but in human reality, right? As it will always be. And there is no time that passes without, without us confirming this step by step from every single military engagement we study, present or past, we could say. So von Clausewitz says a single fault committed may be, and there would be also other things to add, like take medieval warfare. Even a single battle was ever less decisive at the time because there were other means that, strategically speaking, can be employed. So in Napoleonic times, great battles really, decided the fate of entire chunks of Europe, for example. That's why even you can't see the amplification of that issue, and that's why even the great battle in previous times was kind of a simpler thing, let's say. Then he writes, a single fault committed may be repaired next time. From good fortune and chance we can hope for more favor on another occasion, and that's what we're talking about specifically now, comparing greater, smaller battles and larger also, and tinier, let's say, battles. But the sum total of moral and physical forces cannot be so quickly altered, right? You see, so even if you analyzed Napoleonic battles are as a a smaller series of engagements, as the same from Clausewitz reasons, like, because as we've seen, that's what how you compose a combat unit. He needs to put it, to use it in his terms, right? You cannot erase the absolute result of it, and especially the circumstances of how this happened, that are properly, as we've seen, more important, because there is something there that generates other consequences in the ways the thing happened, right? And therefore, what the award of a victory has decided appears of much greater importance for all futurity. Very probably, of all concerned in battles, whether in or out of the army, very few have given a thought to this difference, but the course of the battle itself impresses on the minds of all present in it such a conviction, and the relation discourse in public documents, however much it may be colored by twisting particular circumstances, shows also more or less to the world at large that the causes were more of a general than of a particular nature, right? So, in other words, do not try to search military history for, as in life in general, explanation for why things happen aside from the outcome of whatever, but properly of complex systems, to trying to find a simple answer to it, right? Simple meant thinking it was by chance simple, right? This is silly, right? And this is constantly done over and over and over again. That is to say, that system defeated one other because I show you like how now look at how the sword was held. The other guy made that. The entire war was won. there are people like that, unfortunately. There is the mechanistic, technologistic prejudices in the West have not helped at all in this, right? And they are easily mirroring the utter ignorance that exists, not just in military, but properly, thanks to the Clausewitzian Trinity that shows it to us, politics and society. Because you can easily understand that a person that believes that a battle was won simply because, once again, there was some smart genius who understood how to beat the other guy in hand-to-hand combat. Yeah, right, you have to hold the shield like that or the bike like that. Is a person that also probably, when he's going to vote or to understand, trying to understand an important social issue, has not the slightest idea what he's talking about, and will come up probably with another stupid explanation like that, right? And this is the majority of the people that live on this earth, by definition. And this costs to all of us, not just to them, to each and every one of us. And it has always costed this, and it's an enormous problem, right? Because it's the causes why disasters happen in the first place, at every level, military, political, and social, and very much of the time, like, actually, they are all one thing, right? And we should expand on this, but the Clausewitzian, the Clausewitzian theory always leaves a lot of room for this reflection. The chapter is long. I will not digress, but I presume, throughout all these more than 100 Vom Kriege's videos, we have explained enough, made my point enough clear about the unspeakable relevance of this whole work and why it should be studied thoroughly by, if it was by every person this art, we would definitely live in a much better place, right? Then von Clausewitz says he who has not been present at the loss of a great battle will have difficulty in forming for himself a living or quite true idea of it, and the abstract notions of this or that small untoward affair will never come up to the perfect conception of a lost battle. Let us stop a moment at the picture. And now von Clausewitz gives a beautiful description. Before it, I just wanted to tell you that, connecting with what we had just said, von Clausewitz is telling us that a person who has never been there cannot understand what it's about, mostly exactly because nobody has ever suffered, morally speaking, in that fashion. It's not about picturing what happens graphically, right? It's not what a video game or a movie can tell. You can even be blind on a battlefield and still feel that, right? And it's something that tears yourself apart, rips your heart off your chest and throws it in the mud. It sucks away your soul. It devastates your mind, right? And we do know what these effects are on human psyche after a battle, right? And they're devastating. They're pathological. There are people that were not going to recover. There are people actually were just going to die because of the shock. Von Clausewitz says, the first thing which overpowers the imagination, and we may say indeed also the understanding, is the diminution of the masses. Then the loss of ground which takes place always, more or less, and therefore on the side of the silent also, if he is not fortunate, then the rupture of the original formation, the jumbling together of troops, the risks of retreat, which with few exceptions may always be seen, sometimes in a less, sometimes in a greater degree. Next, the retreat, the most part of which commences at night, or at least goes on throughout the night. On this first march we must at once leave behind a number of men completely worn out and scattered about, often just the bravest, who have been foremost in the fight, who held out the longest. The feeling of being conquered, which only seized the superior officers on the battlefield, now spreads through all ranks. Right? Even down to the common soldiers, aggravated by the horrible idea of being obliged to leave in the enemy's hands so many brave comrades, who but a moment since were of such value to us in the battle, and aggravated by a rising distrust to the chief, to whom more or less every subordinate attributes as fault the fruitless efforts he has made, and this feeling of being conquered is no ideal picture over which one might become master. It is an evident truth that the enemy is superior to us, a truth of which the causes might have been so latent before that they were not to be discovered, but which in the issue comes out clear and palpable, or which was also, perhaps, before suspected, but which in the want of any certainty we had to oppose by the hope of chance, reliance on good fortune, providence, or a bold attitude. Now, all this has proved insufficient, and the bitter truth meets us harsh and imperious. Right. So there is actually a number of very interesting details and information in this paragraph. Right. We could talk, for example, about the fact that what impresses is literally looking at the units breaking apart. Right. This is perhaps the thing that I can less understand as I've never been in a defeat, so not why, and obviously the fact that this happens, but the effect, as von Clausewitz is saying, that this procures to the human mind. How can an army that looks so fearful and and compact and mighty can simply melt away? That is devastating. Then the fact also that those who are left behind usually are actually the bravest, not the cowardly. The cowardly runs away, right? We're here talking about cowards. We're talking about the fact that every person breaks at every moment, and it's extremely easy to make break even the person that you think it's the toughest in the war. It's so easy. It doesn't take anything. But properly that who remains behind most of the time is the guy that has fought and got wounded and cannot retreat for that reason. The blame put on irrationally on the chiefs by everybody, right? It's also interesting the fact that that there is this sense of are we winning, are we not winning? That first is just proper of the officers, and that spreads among the rest of the units, because that shows you literally what how clearer the reality is since the very beginning to the command, then towards to the man. And this reaction that however encompasses a bit everybody, it says it's the fault of the old man, right? He messed up badly, and all what I've spent here talks about the fatigue, the efforts, right? This is a psychophysical devastation. That is to say, I have been spilling blood here, other people's and my own's, and this is the result. I lose. I risk to die now. This is over. We're being destroyed, and further, our homes will be destroyed. Our country will be invaded. Is this it? This is it. You don't want to believe that, so you have to blame the commander-in-chief automatically. Maybe it's true, right? Maybe that's where the problem lays most of the times, actually. But the point is that there is this incapacitation for which you cannot accept even you have lost. But the most beautiful thing that von Clausewitz stresses here, in my opinion, is properly this matter of what the truth is really like, is that once the great battle is being fought and you have lost, there are no excuses in front of reality to conjecture, will we make it, we will not. Just think about having spent months and months on campaign, and to get to that point, right? Think about all what you have suffered, all the forces you have spent to be there, how much you were waiting for this, but it doesn't seem real. And here, von Clausewitz says, at some point you recognize it. It's as if there was a presence in the air. You realize this thing, you have been defeated, you have been broken, you've been destroyed, you've been beaten. Right? And you can't deny that. You can't pretend it is not true. Right? You can't even, doesn't matter what the reason was. Right? Now, it's only now that you can realize what it really is. Von Clausewitz has been through this stuff. Right? He writes then, all these feelings are widely different from a panic. This is also important, which in an army fortified by military virtue never, and in any other only exceptionally, follows the loss of a battle. This is interesting. You would think it's panic that properly strikes you at that point, it's not quite the thing, right? Because battles are not just, brawls in a way. Panic here, I don't want to descend into even the etymology of the term and the cultural context, the military context, by the way, also from which it emerged. But here, Clausewitz gives us the idea that it's not the terror. It's not like people flee because they just want to run away desperately. We often get this picture, but the point is that battles normally are lost in ways that seem to be way less dramatic at the same moment, right? From a just exterior point of view. What he stresses here, in fact, is the moral, the inner perception that is devastating. How do you imagine a retreat? Everybody runs. You can't run for much. A retreat is usually something fairly slow, right? Unless, of course, you're not chased directly, but, in this greater engagements, of course, there's a general retreat, surely a disorderly one, surely a messed up one and confused, and then there are these moments of fear, terror, but in many ways, think about it. Think about what it could mean for you just to, if you've lost a battle, you have to run away, and you have just tens of kilometers before you can reach somewhere you can be, reasonably safe. You can expect to be reasonably safe. How do you do that? Can you run for tens of kilometers just with your gear, with all the exhaustion of the battle, how you're worn out psychologically by all of this, and physically most of the time as well? How do you think it happens? Right? This is very important to picture. I don't know if you ever, if you studied, battles from sources and you try to picture it, this could really be. This is very important, actually, to stress. Clausewitz writes, they must arise, the feelings, even in the best of armies, and although long habituation to war and victory, together with great confidence in a commander, may modify them a little here and there, they are never entirely wanting in the first moment, right? They are not the pure consequences of lost trophies. These are usually lost at a later period, and the loss of them does not become generally known so quickly. Right? Even the realization of a defeat. Have you ever thought about that? How do all troops realize that there's been a defeat? This is no movie. This is no video game. Battlefields can extend for kilometers. Communication is slow. Most of not even the winners actually may realize. Actually, especially the winners, I think have more problems to realize they have actually won. Right? Clausewitz writes, they will therefore not fail to appear even when the scale turns in the slowest and most gradual manner. And then they constitute that effect of a victory upon which we can always count in every case. Right. So here, don't get me wrong. This is still dramatically impacting, as we have seen, especially at an individual level. But it spreads gradually. Right. It's obvious that the point of the line, it starts wearing, breaking. Of course, that's in the midst, in the heat of action. It's terribly messed up, but that's an exception in many ways. What about the rest of the army? Most of the army actually flees without even having fought. Usually, in certain at least greater. Now, I'm thinking mostly of older time, but generally speaking, yeah. Even in more recent ones, it's not that the defeat gets, in fact, from a physical point of view, so devastating, right? This is the point von Clausewitz is making since the beginning. It's probably what happens later that really starts make the difference in a more appreciable fashion. Then von Clausewitz says, we have already said that the number of trophies intensifies this effect. So if you remember from the previous chapters, the trophies are basically one of the major indicators of the entity of a defeat, right? So their securing can occur even some hours after the battle. We don't know how, as we were saying, nobody's fully certain that the situation cannot be reversed. Certain circumstances, so it's not even their immediate loss, as in the previous paragraph he has just stated. It really makes the thing eventually, and how the devastation and defeat occurs later. Von Clausewitz says, it is evident that an army in this condition, looked at as an instrument, is weakened, right? How can we expect that when reduced to such a degree that, as we said before, it finds new enemies in all the ordinary difficulties of making war, it will be able to recover by fresh efforts what has been lost? Before the battle, there was a real or assumed equilibrium between the two sides. This is lost, and therefore some external assistance is requisite to restore it. Every new effort without such external support can only lead to fresh losses. Right. So there is a specific reason, as we've seen also once again in previous paragraphs. If a fight is settled, right, there is a reason why it is so. And who is defeated has no way. There is no way he is going to return to battle at that point, because the battle has already been decided. Right. This can be reversed with reserves, with helps, as Von Clausewitz is saying here, but the substance is that specific combat unit has been decided, has been resolved, has seeded its tactical potential, has released it once again into the strategical one. Thus, therefore, Von Clausewitz writes, the most moderate victory of the chief army must tend to cause a constant sinking of the scale on the opponent's side. You like this as a metaphor? It's actually pretty good, because it makes you understand that, morally speaking, the consequences of defeat are ever more evident. Right, just as we were saying before, just think about information, how news spread, how, even voices inflate the thing. You're there risking your life, so you're very thoughtful in considering all this stuff, because it's about your skin, right? And also, there is also a much broader consequence at the strategical level. So this is going to change a lot. There's an equilibrium in many ways that has been lost, as we've seen. So that was the equilibrium that was formed, strategically speaking, to bring to the battle. So strategically speaking, this thing now has to reorder itself in a way quickly, right? That is not easy even to foresee. So the result of uncertainty, this adds to the anxiety, to the broader problem, the way it is. So Von Clausewitz says, if these the external circumstances are to bring about a change, are not near, if the conqueror is an eager opponent who, thirsting for glory, pursues great aims, then a first-rate commander, and in the beaten army a true military spirit, hardened by many campaigns, are required in order to stop the swollen stream of prosperity from bursting all bounds, and to moderate its course by small but reiterated acts of resistance until the force of victory has spent itself at the goal of its career. Right? So, what Von Clausewitz is saying here is that in order to contain the results, the consequences of this result, you have to be pretty strong in terms of command and virtue of the army in the broader strategical situation, because if you find a winner that at this point wants to pursue his aim and he wants to press on, right, you are in deep trouble, right? Because at this point, the greater the battle has been, and the more it's been shown that if that was your best shot, you failed. What are your chances to contain the enemy now, where the equilibrium has dramatically shifted in his favor? This is often also taken for granted as, oh well, you lost a battle, let's prepare another point. No, in reality, there is an enormous obstacle, impediment for that to happen, right? Because you're going to essentially either commit ever more resources, but you have to squeeze yourself at that point, and it could even be counterproductive. So it's terrifying if you think about it. Von Clausewitz says also, and here starts discussing the thing, we have to admit there is a few exactly because of the essence of this result, of the great battle was talking about, that it can't be done afterwards. So even for what the theory of the art of warfare is concerned, you may not have all of this great, chances after this, but there's not much you can do by manual, let's say, probe. So von Clausewitz then says, and now, as to the effect of defeated beyond the army upon the nation and government. So here we're passing throughout, we've seen the tactical dimension, the strategic dimension, now we pass to the political and social issue now, because he says, it is the sudden collapse of hopes stretched to the utmost, because this was the great battle, the downfall of all self-reliance. In place of these extinct forces, fear, with its destructive properties of expansion, rushes into the vacuum left and completes the prostration. Right? This is where actually the greatest damage is done. It's not even about the army. It's about whoever has to use this means has invested in them, and what his judgment will be for reasons that may not be strictly military. Think about the Vietnam War. Right? It's not that it was any kind of concrete disaster, defeat, or whatever, but it was called off for reasons that had impacted at that point politically and socially speaking that we were fighting. We're talking about from the American side. The Vietnam War was actually not won by anyone, right? But at least in fact, of this outer consequences after all. Because that's what really matters, right? You can't see a war just as for the sake of itself. Like a football match, you say, okay, we have fun with this, or we break each other bones in it, but at least at the end, it's still a game. Now, this is not still a game. This is probably two people that want to beat each other, to impose on one another their own will, violently, even killing each other if it's necessary. So this is not a game. This is more like when you have a fight with someone, and that's what you should always try to relate to all what is written in the Vom Kriege, because it's exactly the same thing. It's how von Clausewitz starts the Vom Kriege. He says, plain and simple, war is nothing but a duel on a large scale. It is exactly it. Because if you understand what a duel, right, not in the romantic sense, but properly in the fight between two people, because that's what he meant by that. There is not something more, there is nothing essentially different from a war. It's not like a war. It is it, because war in the Clausewitzian theory equates to violence. It's not even about even having an army. It's about the fact that you decide to employ violence, right, of any type. Violence doesn't mean that I just touch you physically and harm you physically. Violence can be, every form of pressure that you impose on someone in that regard. And it is constantly carried out by everybody. We live like that. We also genetically, biologically programmed to function like that. We respond to stimulus, to stimuli from the external, right? In the same way, we are programmed to react like that. With properly, what do you think adrenaline is about? What's this the tremendous effort? What is this, tense state of mind? It's exactly the same thing. And it's beautiful because it's that simple, right? There is no need to make it more complicated than it is. Of course, war is dramatically more complicated than a duel. But it is just because it's a broader system, but not because it's essentially different from it, right? It's just physics, if you want. Larger systems are more difficult to regulate. That's physics, but it doesn't entail that the intentions and the means are different from the one of a smaller system. They are exactly the same, and that's the beauty of it, which we can all understand. This work is so simple to study. Yeah, I mean, it's 800 pages, but if you have the patience to try to understand it, you hear it. Now, I'm doing this from a long time, and my language is simple. I'm not like an expert on this topic in absolute terms. I mean, not having specifically the philosophical, philological, maybe not even the historical competences for doing it, because surely, I never studied this aside from this interest of mine, but studying it now makes me realize, for all this long time, that the content is extremely clear. There's a clarity of mind, of expression, of vision in this author that is truly genial. It really makes you understand the thing, because it is really simple. It's not easy. This is it. This is not easy, but it's simple. As most important things actually are. Right? When things become too complicated to explain, it's because probably there's something in the person's explanation that really doesn't work. This is really simple. It really tells you how it is. Right? And Clausewitz goes on and says, it is a real shock upon the nerves which one of the two athletes receives from the electric spark victory. Right? And that effect, however different in its degrees, is never completely wanting. Instead of every one hastening with a spirit of determination to aid in repairing the disaster, every one fears that his efforts will only be in vain, and stops hesitating with himself when he should rush forward. Or in despondency he lets his arm drop, leaving everything to fate. This is also a very beautiful passage, which von Clausewitz makes you understand properly quantitatively speaking, what it means to be defeated. And once again, even here you can relate to here, speaking of athletes, you wonder why he uses all these metaphors, because he really means them, right? It's the athlete. I practiced swimming for 12 years. I can tell you that, I didn't compete, but sometimes I did actually. And you can feel the thing. You can feel the idea that you have been training up to that point, that you've done all these great efforts, that you've spent time and energies all to come to one point. But even think about exams. This is very, very relatable. What's the frustration when you fail an exam that you have prepared maybe for months on? Right? That is incomparable. It's very intense. It's very intense. It can influence you in a way you wouldn't believe. This is exactly the thing. It's the moment. It's the shock. It's the electric shock of the information that arrives to your brain that makes you, not literally the shock, but you understand, the shock of the new as it comes after this terrifying effort that at some point makes you simply say, okay, I give up. Like, I don't want to know anything about this anymore because I'm done. Like, I spent all my energies and I can't do it. And this is how the outcome of battle from the defeated side looks like most of the time. It's very difficult. It takes a lot of moral strength and forces to just say, we got defeated. I got it, but now let's try to do something about it again. Right? Just great figures are capable of doing this, because, as von Clausewitz put it before, until you're there, you cannot understand what it can be. It's like when people tell you, if you have never been depressed, you can't properly understand what it is, because even in there, it's the moral thing that you don't expect. You don't expect how much your brain can bring you down, how powerful it is, right? And how shocking and devastating these experiences are. You cannot properly understand it if you have not been in them. That's why even always remember that von Clausewitz is writing this for the sake of the theory of the art of war. So it's not that he's pointing that out for criticizing someone in line of principle. He's doing it specifically in order to tell you that if you want to go to war, you should know this, because you have to put it into account as properly what the strategic, especially outcome, consequence of a tactical outcome is concerned. You have to know that it's not like in a game where you lost those card games, you lost that round, you can't do it better next time, and it will just be a simple sum, a mathematical sum of the points. Here, there are consequences that you cannot even think to stop, right? This is dramatic. It's you can't even fully control your army. How can you think you control the outcome of a battle from a moral point of view? This is the extraordinary work in von Clausewitz. Then he writes, the consequence which this effect of victory brings forth in the course of the war itself depend in part on the character and talent of the victorious general, sure, but more on the circumstances from which the victory proceeds and to which it leads. Right. So what von Clausewitz is saying, we have, as we have just stressed, actually, there's certain things you can't control in this, but naturally, it makes an important difference to have, for example, an enemy that is going to exploit this victory he has achieved on you, and then another that doesn't. Right? This is very important, and it's probably more important because it comes from a direction that raises ever more above from the battlefield in many ways. What's the strategic point of this all? Right, von Clausewitz says, without boldness and an enterprising spirit on the part of the leader, the most brilliant victory will lead to no great success, and its force exhausts itself all the sooner on circumstances if these offer strong and stubborn opposition to it. How very differently from Daun, Frederick the Great would have used the victory at Kolin, and what different consequences France, in place of Prussia, might have given a battle of Leuden. Right, so here is saying, in this case specifically, a major general or a major country had been behind these victories, they may have had way greater consequences because they could have pushed forward in a way these others didn't historically. So that's probably also a way of measuring this, the fact, listing one factor that brings to the spread of all these moral consequences, and not just that, but properly, now strategic decisions to bring to it. Von Clausewitz writes, the conditions which allow us to expect great results from a great victory we shall learn when we come to the subjects with which they are connected. Then it will be possible to explain the disproportion which appears at first sight between the magnitude of a victory and its results, from which we started. So you understand that by passing from the battlefield to the campaign, to the government, to the country, once again, this is not a military business even anymore. Von Clausewitz says this in a while, but he goes on and says, and which is only, talking about the disproportion, too readily attributed to a want of energy on the part of the conqueror. Here, where we have to do with the great battle in itself, we shall merely say that the effects now depicted never fail to attend the victory, that they mount up with the intensive strength of the victory. Mount up more the whole strength of the army has been concentrated in it, the more the whole military power of the nation is contained in that army, and the state in that military power. So here it connects the whole, all the ladder, the chain, tactics, strategy, politics, and society. Politics and society together, tactics and strategy also together as the military thing together with the other two in the Clausewitzian Trinity. That is to say, of course, as we were saying before, the more we invested, it's a if you want, it's just a mathematical principle. Even for what moral forces are concerned, it's just we can't properly calculate them quantitatively, numerically speaking, but it's the point. The more you invest in something and it fails, the more it's devastating. Just think about it economically speaking. You invest a lot of money, you lose them, and say, wow. Like, it's not that you're particularly happy. You're surely not, you're surely not happier than you had lost less money, even in proportion to another battle. So this is important because even the commitment of the forces in a single battle can vary. As you've seen in the great battle, tendentially, the intents are more intense by definition. But it may as well be that there are circumstances which even important battles are fought which the army didn't fully, or the politics, or the country didn't properly express their greatest commitment. So that paradoxically may even lead to disaster, but not having such a dramatic impact after all. So that is really important to stress as well. Von Clausewitz says, but then the question may be asked, can theory accept this effect as absolutely necessary? Must it not rather endeavor to find out counteracting means capable of neutralizing these effects? That is to say, shouldn't a theory of the art of war be concerned in, dealing with the spread of these moral effects? Von Clausewitz says, it seems quite natural to answer this question in the affirmative, but heaven defend us from taking that wrong course of most theories, out of which is begotten a mutually devouring pro et contra, right? Now he explains why. This is useless in many ways, because first of all, there's properly a dimension of this that, as we've seen, surpasses the military one. So the theory of the art of war at that point is, not even committed to the thing. But also, what are we talking about? Like, how can you materially stamp that? Right? In fact, he says, if we had to explain this theory, you would just have just a pro et contra, like it was like the military theory before looking at the actual, outcome of military historical battles, right? And saying, let's just ideally think of how a battle could be fought or not without looking at what happens in reality. That is to say, this is fantasy and nonsense. Von Clausewitz says, certainly that effect is perfectly necessary. That is to say, of course, you cannot avoid it, right? And why? For it has its foundation in the nature of things, and it exists, even if we find means to struggle against it, right? Why? Because the battle, the great battle, is fought exactly for that purpose. Like, you wouldn't fight it if it didn't have that effect. You wouldn't commit the greatest, some of the most dramatic and overwhelming investment of resources in the entire history of humanity, like major battles have been historically, if you weren't sure that thing would bring hopefully to the annihilation of the enemy and this dramatic effect. How do you think that wars began to be fought without with a pure rationalization and trying to fit? No, they began to be fought simply because people realized perfectly well how the thing worked, and they realized that the battle in itself, for reasons that even just come to exist without needing to rationalize them, oblige you to fight in a certain way, but also have this consequence exactly because you fight in that way, right? Because as a human being, we do in this way, right? And especially, what do we fight for if we're not trying to force someone to fulfill our will, right? What do you think we fight? Because for the sake of it, because we like it? We are suffering for doing it. There must be a hell of a good reason we're doing it. This is against any idiocy about the irrationality or instinctivity or barbarity of war. War is one of the most civilized, rational, and human things in absolute terms you can ever find. It's actually counter-instinctual. People do not go to get killed because they're stupid. There is a point for it. There's a pretty valid one. And it's pretty universal, historically speaking. There is not a society that doesn't use violence. Because all humans do, in the same way, right? It's extremely stupid to attribute any culturalist stigma to any reality for saying that these were just barbarians because they were fighting. A person who reasons like that has not the slightest intelligence in historical terms. Not the slightest. Von Clausewitz says, just as the motion of a cannonball is always in the direction of the terrestrial, though when fired from east to west, part of the general velocity is destroyed by this opposite motion. You can't do anything about it. Even if you wanted to counter those moral effects of the tactical outcome, you wouldn't be able to, right? You can, as we've seen, press more or less if you're the winner, but at that point it's your interest to press on it to make those effects develop further. And if you can, because at that point you are you have the upper hand because you have just one you can press on. The other cannot, as we've seen by definition, do anything at that point without the external help of other forces that commit once again more resources that once again bring to at some point to clash with the enemy once again with the identical result. There is no way out of this. It's properly a physical principle as well, right? This could be studied physically speaking in terms of entropy. Like, think about how much energy it costed to put together an army in terms of training, supplies, everything, command, all the skill that comes. What's the cost of a war, right? It's an entire wars are products of entire civilizations. How do you make planes fly or tanks fly or ships sail? Right? That's how the world has come to be in terms of industry, in intelligence, in progress. That's what we bring into war. And think in this short destructive moment of a battle, how much of that is lost in terms of purely energetic terms, and how much you cannot recompose it anymore. Right? It's disaster at this point. The system has fallen apart in a way you can't read it. That energy spent, you can't put the thing together unless you don't bring other energy in. And this is why this is so devastating, because it does really have a major impact on the resources you invested. They are burnt. This is incredibly important. I can't stress it enough. When Clausewitz says, all war supposes human weakness, and against that is directed. You understand what this is all about. You fight with someone because you want that person to give up. Because you know that humans are weak after all. They're not going to tolerate more than much. They're going to prefer to be, to lose something than to be oppressed in another way. Right? You direct your force against humanity because you know what other humans as a humans are made of. There's no way you can think a human is not devastated by a defeat. No way. For Clausewitz says, therefore, if hereafter, in another place, we examine what is to be done after the loss of a great battle, if we bring under review the resources which still remain, even in the most desperate cases, if we should express a belief in the possibility of retrieving all, even in such a case, it must not be supposed we mean thereby that the effects of such a defeat can by degrees be completely wiped out. For the forces and means used to repair the disaster might have been applied to the realization of some positive object. And this applies both to the moral and physical forces. What did you fight that major battle for? If you had other resources to invest in it, right? In any case, you've lost it. A great part of them because you decided to segment them and you didn't bring them all together. We have seen how dramatically important it is, the concentration of forces, especially from a strategical point of view. That is what brings to the great battle, by definition. Right? And at that point, yes, there are certain things that Foucault says, you can do after you are defeated to try to contain some of this effect. But still it's not going to be nearly enough, because for that thing to have happened in the first place, already you have spent what you had to prevent. Right? This is incredibly important, again and again. Right? This thing is becoming ever more interesting. It's dramatically fascinating. Foucault says, another question is whether through the loss of a great battle, forces are not perhaps roused into existence, which otherwise would never have come to life. This case is certainly conceivable, and it is what has actually occurred with many nations, but to produce this intensified reaction is beyond the province of military art, which can only take account of it. It might be assumed as a possibility. That is to say, is a victory capable of creating new forces within the winner? And in this sense, can they be, inserted, the mean of can be inserted in theory of the art of war? But Foucault says, well, it's obvious that certain victories have brought to some countries and nations to emerge right? There are many examples, historically speaking, that a victory could give the confidence it was needed to keep to maintain, to continue the struggle, right? And to bring it to great results, right? But this is mostly to do with politics and society, right? It's not much of a military matter. Of course, a great victory can help, but at that point you should concern yourself with the theory of the art of war, and of course with certain, also with as we've seen with, for example, exploiting this advantage that you have after after victory, etc. But at the same time, there is no specific way to make it properly a national thing, right? What is needed to awaken a nation, that's not something that outer the instrumental use of a battle is to be found in the way it's performed, right? And it depends once again on factors that have brought to the thing to happen since the political root of the military action, in all its further connection, rather than the a simple way you fought the battle, like by manual, right, or by theory, if you want. No, it's not like that, and therefore it can happen that a country awakens after victory, but it's largely not a military point, it's a political and social point, right, why it happens. Then Clausewitz says, if there are cases in which the fruits of a victory appear rather of a destructive nature in consequence of the reaction of the forces which it had the effect of rousing into activity, cases which certainly are very exceptional, that it must the more surely be granted that there is a difference in the effects which one and the same victory may produce according to the character of the people or state which has been conquered, right? So this is a predisposition, if you want, not something you can awaken just by military art, right? And this is pretty much it. So, beautiful chapter, by the way. We will continue next time with the same topic, actually the employment of the battle proper as such. For now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.